Could you briefly talk about Sanshinji and your role here, what you do here?
Well, I'm the vice abbot here, so I'm the person who's going to be taking over for Hojo-san when he steps back from daily leadership here in 2023. So we're really fortunate here that this group thought far enough ahead that we have an actual 7-year transition, which in America is not common. My peers are exceedingly jealous because what often happens in a Dharma center is the teacher says, next year I'm retiring. And because these are organizations with boards of directors and various committees and sanghas and whatever, people need to plan for that. And when a teacher steps back, there's a lot of handoff that needs to happen. So it's not only this sort of daily operational stuff, it's just the leadership of the practice and the flavor of the practice. So in our case, we were very fortunate that Hojo-san could look around and he has a number of students and disciples who might be ready to take on leadership, and so he was able to find a way for us to go forward. But in many small Dharma centers, there is no obvious successor. And so it's actually a live question in America at the moment. Succession has been a hot topic in this country for a good 5 or 7 years, just because we have many teachers who are starting to age out. And how do we go forward in this country with this practice? There aren't so many young people coming in. So how do we continue to go forward? So in the case of Sanshin, we were very fortunate because this group looked ahead quite a bit, and Hojo-san identified a plan and a timeline for himself pretty early on. So I was named as the person to come in behind him and sort of pick up from him and keep this place going forward, keep the practice going forward. So I arrived in Bloomington a couple of years ago. I was one of his students who actually didn't live here and was not from here. I'm from Minnesota, spent most of my life in Minnesota. So my teaching relationship with him was a long-distance one, so I came here when I could, but like many of my Dharma brothers and sisters, I did most of my practice where I was living. And that's not uncommon for us in this Sangha, so we don't all live here. I've probably got 2.5 dozen Dharma brothers and sisters in robes around the world, literally around the world, so they're not all living in Bloomington at any given time. So it makes us a really a global Sangha, right? So we're all training in the ways that we can, and we're staying in touch with Hojo-san in the ways that we can. But for me, when I was asked to come and take on the vice abbacy, there was no vice abbot at that point, so I'm the first one who's had this role. And so to come in as an American female behind a Japanese male teacher is very interesting. And actually we got some... there was some good feeling around the country as people saw this happening. Here was an American female coming in as the next leader, so that was a whole interesting conversation in itself, right? But yeah, so at this point we're really thinking about all the aspects of our practice and all the aspects of how we run this temple and how things are going to go forward as Hojo-san continues his transition toward being a founding teacher, as opposed to being the person who's leading the everyday practice and leading all of the operations of the place. So I'm working with the board of directors, I'm working with the practice committee, I'm working with Sangha members and with Hojo-san himself to just identify what needs to go forward from here and how does that happen. Making a transition from a Japanese teacher to an American teacher, I want to do that really carefully. It's really possible to lose some things intentionally or not, which are really important to the practice, but somehow they get lost because we don't fully understand them. There are some subtleties of Japanese culture and Japanese practice that we need to be careful not to lose. Or if we're going to set them aside, we need to do that with intention and really understanding what we're doing, and not just losing things because, well, we don't know what that is, or, well, that doesn't feel relevant or something, right? I think in many ways for American people picking up a practice that didn't originate in this culture, we have an advantage, I think, in some ways that maybe even Japanese people don't, because it really forces us to take a step back. And when we're looking around at things like bowing, Western people sometimes have some real resistance to something like bowing. I think we get the chance to step back and say, well, this is something we don't do in our culture, so if I'm resistant to that, what's that about? Is there some ego in there? Is there some self in there? So unlike a practice or a tradition which is sort of pervasive in our culture and something to which we're born, maybe, We don't accept a lot of these things just because they've always been here. It's all new for us. So we have to do a lot of religious education, in Western Zen, because most of us are starting from scratch. We weren't born into Buddhist families. We probably encountered this practice either, maybe we took comparative religion in school, maybe we're disillusioned somehow with the faith tradition we grew up in. There's lots of reasons, people come in. But because we really start from scratch, we really get to examine all aspects of our practice. So in a way, that's, I think, kind of an advantage for us. Right? And that's something I think that happens at Sanshin. People arrive here, and we certainly want people to feel welcome and to not feel intimidated or, to be scared or something, because it would be easy to say, well, this is all just pretty exotic. I mean, people are wearing weird stuff and, women with shaved heads and what's going on. So we really, of course, want people to feel welcome, but also not to just throw things out without really investigating them.
Talking about kind of leaving these Japanese traditions behind, either not doing that, or if we're doing that purposely.
Yeah.
Especially in other Zen centers that have either been started by American people or are now run by American people. I'm thinking in Texas and stuff, there are some that have been started by Suzuki's American successors. And do you find that, Hojo-san was talking about, a lot of these things are changing too quickly. Do you find that they're often kind of sloughing some of these off without kind of realizing what's happening?
It's always felt really important to me that we really understand, as well as we can, the Japanese elements of our practice, because that's the container in which these things arose, at least for us. Our immediate past ancestors are Japanese, so it feels important to understand the context for that as we're going forward in this country. So there's a real live conversation, and there has been for a long time in this country, about how much of the Japanese influence should we retain going forward, and how much can we let go of kind of safely, right? So in this country, given that we are rugged individualists as Americans, each Sangha tends to want to work that out for itself. So in this country, we have some Sanghas that would call themselves quite contemporary, possibly ecumenical. That could be ecumenical Buddhist or just ecumenical, right? Who have largely developed their forms and their practice around things which are not so Japanese. And if that's comfortable for them and they can maintain a strong practice, there's nothing wrong with that. There are other Sanghas, perhaps like ours, that wanted to retain a certain amount of that flavor. Now, in my experience, the farther away a Sangha gets from the last Japanese ancestor, the more of those Japanese elements might change. I think it's partly because there isn't a Japanese person there sort of carrying that. And if you have a Sangha where not so many people have been to Japan or practiced in Japan or trained in Japan, then there isn't that sort of experience of that. It's hard to carry something that you haven't experienced, right? So it makes logical sense that the farther we get away from a Japanese ancestor, the more things might change. So here at Sanshin, our Japanese founder is still here and practicing with us every day and carrying that forward. And for us, we are affiliated with the denomination, which means we're required to practice in Japan for at least 6 months. It's part of the process of being recognized as clergy by Sodoshu. At this moment, there are not accredited training temples yet in this country. We're working on building one in California, but right now, in order to be recognized Sodoshu clergy, you have to train in Japan because that's where the temples are that can accredit you. So that means all of us have at least some small experience of the kind of temple the Dogen was in when he was teaching his students. So if in his writings he's making reference to the door curtain or the pillar at the back, we know what that looks like because we've been in those places. So we can carry that forward a little bit, So I think it's really important to understand as best we can the context for this practice so that we can make good choices about what do we carry forward in an American context with American people, largely lay people, right? Because, when you look around American Sanghas, most of them are not clergy in training or clergy. They're lay people, they're householders, they're doing their practice in the midst of raising children, holding down a job, maintaining their household, living their lives kind of out in the world. And it's important to recognize that. It feels important to me to honor lay practice for what it is, because it's completely valid, and not to think, well, everybody needs to be a monk, or to think that's the only way to practice in this country. And it isn't the only way to practice anywhere, right? I mean, in Japan, there's lay practice. So I think we have to just be intentional about what do we carry forward, how do we support the practitioners that are actually here, and yet not lose touch with our ancestors and the context for these traditions, and somehow to maintain the opportunity to step back from our everyday sort of habituated thinking and look carefully at what we're doing. And I think being immersed in a practice which didn't arise in this culture is an opportunity for that, right? So I think in that way, Zen practice, in addition to everything else that's going on with it, I think it also gives us that opportunity to look carefully at our own cultural filters and to look at our assumptions about who we are and what we're doing and how the world is, right? So I would not want to lose touch with those roots, because I think they provide something really important.
All right, so can you talk about how you came to practice Zen Buddhism?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I was growing up, as a family, we didn't practice any one particular thing. I was baptized Episcopalian, as all the women in my family were when we were little. But we didn't practice anything as a family. So when I became a young adult, I started looking for something, as many young adults do. You start to do that search for meaning, and you just think, I want to have some kind of practice. So like many young people, I started read around quite a bit, various traditions, various things. But my father and my mother's mother were both interested in Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion. It was one of the few things they actually had in common. And so that didn't seem like a strange thing for me to investigate. It was like on my list of stuff. So I started reading about that as well. I went to my local branch library and I pulled out a book on Zen, and I read this book, and I understood maybe 5% of it. And I said, there's something here for me. I get this in a way that I can't explain, right? Turns out the guy who wrote this book was Katagiri Roshi, who had started the Minnesota Zen Center. I was in Minnesota at the time. I was in the Twin Cities. Turns out he founded the Minnesota Zen Center. Well, he had already died by the time I read this book, but I was not that far from that center. So, of course, this was back in the days before the internet. I had to call them up and say, do you have some brochures you can send me? So here came this little packet in the mail. But there was an introduction to sitting, just like the one we do here, and like most Dharma centers do still today. So I went to the introduction to sitting. So Minnesota Zen Center is in an old house, three-story house. And so the intro Zen was up in the attic, was up on the very top floor. So I came in, I was a little late, Somebody had to get me up to the top floor. So we did our hour and a half or something of being taught how to sit, answering basic questions. And at the end of that, the instructor said, there's a Dharma talk happening downstairs. You're welcome to stay. So after that first visit, somehow being Buddha's birthday was a little bit overwhelming, and so I kind of ducked out the back door. But the very next Saturday, I was back, because it felt to me like there was something in that practice for me. And I started sitting regularly and showing up there every week and becoming quite involved with the center. So the rest, as they say, is history. But at that time, Hojo-san was the teacher there, because Katagiri Roshi had already died. So he was the one teaching there, and that's how I first met him and connected with him. So after a while, I took lay precepts there. So as a lay person, made a commitment to the practice and continued to practice. And over the course of time, felt like my practice was important enough to me that I thought I'd like to help other people who also want to practice, which was the sort of impetus for deciding to become a novice, which I did there. So I ordained first with somebody, after Hojo-san had moved on, I ordained first with the teacher who came in after him, who was not a Sodashu affiliated person. But I thought that affiliation was really important to me, so I ended up ultimately reordaining with Hojo-san to have that affiliation. So I practiced in Minnesota. Hojo-san started his place in Bloomington, and so it was a long-distance teaching relationship for quite a while. But ultimately then, I went to Japan, finished my training, did my own practice, went to run the Milwaukee Zen Center for a couple of years when that teacher retired. Then I went to Hokioji in southern Minnesota and was the communications director there for 3 years. And at that point then, kind of got the call that they needed somebody to come and take over for Hojo-san as part of that 7-year transition. So came here, and here I am.
So as an American teacher, how do you find you teach differently or engage with American students differently than your own Japanese teacher?
Well, for many Americans, this practice is quite psychological. So people will come to the teachings and the practice with that kind of point of view, or the habit or something of analyzing the practice in terms of that psychological point of view, or that emotional point of view, which is not something I hear Japanese teachers talk about so much, because I think that's just, in the Japanese culture, that's not the way people approach practice. So I think some American teachers actually come into the practice with a background in therapy or social work, or they have those skills themselves. I'm not one of those people. I don't have that. But I think some teachers come in with that as part of a career that they've already had, and so they're able to meet students kind of in that place. One of the things we have to be careful about as teachers is that if indeed we have backgrounds in therapy, we have to decide, if I'm that teacher, I have to decide, am I this person's Dharma teacher or am I this person's therapist? Because you can't be both. Ethically, you can't be both. So you have to choose. So I think it's a fine line that some American teachers find themselves walking. At what point is this a psychological or a therapeutic kind of relationship, and at what point is this a Dharma teaching relationship? Because the waters get muddied a bit, So for me, I don't come in with a therapy background, and so I'm not engaging with people in that way. But I think the language is different, the metaphors are different. It's perhaps easier to understand why somebody's asking a particular question, even if they can't fully articulate it, But because it's been important for me to be a bridge between traditional practice as it's come out of Japan and the practice that's happening in America, it's been important for me to actually do the training in Japan and to learn a little bit of the language and to try to help facilitate American people understanding the roots of that practice. So for me, that's been an important thing for me in helping Americans come to this practice. Why are we doing what we're doing? What does that word actually mean? So I think I bring that in, which is, I hope, a little bit helpful for people.
Looking at the traditional practice in Japan versus the American practice, is that American practice developing in its own way, or do you think that this American practice is part of a larger modernizing movement that we could even place Kodosawaki and Uchiyama Roshi as part of, almost?
Yeah.
And and it can be kind of a both and answer, I suppose.
Yeah. So the modernization, if you will, of this practice started before it got to this country. So even as far back as World War II, Japanese were looking around and saying, we need to have a certain kind of an image overseas. Buddhist practice is one element, perhaps, of that. So how we position Buddhist practice can make a difference in how people see our country and our culture. So already there were some efforts being made to present Buddhism and to present Zen in a way which was palatable and interesting and accessible to Western people. So it begins to become scientific, it begins to become rational, it begins to become psychological. So things are already being shaped a little bit, even before it gets here. So it starts as far back as that. But of course, when practice comes to this country, it meets influences which are not so much present in Japan, things like European philosophy. So we have the Romanticism, we have the Rationals, and we have the Romantics, right? And that gets mixed up in there. We have the things that are happening in society at the turn of the century, even before. We've got the Industrial Revolution happening. We've got alienization happening. We've got people looking for different ways to think about religion. We just have all of these kind of things which are going on. So there's this real stew, right, of things that are happening. And I think we can't help but be affected by that. It's who we are as American people. It's who we are as Western people. And we have a certain set of filters through which we see things. And we can't help that, right? So when Europeans sort of discover Buddhism in India in the 1700s even, they're seeing it through the only filter they have, which is a Christian filter. So they're seeing somebody they think leading practice, well, that must be a priest. Or they see somebody living in a religious community, that must be a monk. And that thing must be a monastery, right? Because these are the words we had. But they're not actually good descriptors for what we're doing, I mean, in a way you can take a word like priest and say, well, it broadly means anybody who's leading religious practice. But, when I look at what priest really is, well, a priest is a mediator between the people and their God. That's not what I do. I've never called myself a priest. Because we have, we sit down and we do this practice for ourselves. It's like there's no intermediary, right? There's me and there's, what is this thing right here? What is this? So I feel like there's no mediation happening in that way. So I don't use the word like priest. I also don't use the word like monk because we have this impression of somebody who goes into a sort of a cloistered community and never comes out, right? I mean, when you look at the roots of the word monk, it's one, somebody alone, right? Doing some kind of, solitary practice. And so many people who are Dharma leaders in this country are householders. They got families. They're probably working outside the temple because the temple can't afford to feed them. It's not a monk life, right? There is no requirement in Soto Zen as of 1868 with the Meiji Restoration that monks be celibate, that monks not have families. I mean, all of that changed, right? So a word like monk, I think, is a bit not helpful, right? It's describing a life which is not, and certainly for me, not the life I lead. If I'm, for some temporary period of time, in a training temple and living that kind of life, I might say, yes, I'm a nun. But outside of that, kind of not the life I'm living. I own my home, right? I don't live in the temple. So I think all of these factors are influencing how we see the practice and the context for the practice. People want to say that in this country they want to go to a Zen monastery, or they want to go to Japan and go to a Zen monastery. And sometimes what I say to people is, how many Zen monasteries do you think there are in Japan? And people will say thousands, hundreds. Zero. Because this thing we call a Zen monastery is much more like a seminary. It's where we go for some period of time to learn to be clergy, and then we go back out into the world to do that, right? So many of the people who are coming in to a training temple are coming from the family business. They've had a family temple that's been handed down from usually father to son for many generations, and they're coming to the training temple to learn how to take that and take it on, move it on. So, to call something like that a monastery, I think gives Western people the wrong idea. So sometimes I'll say to people, where do you think the Zen monasteries are? They're in the West, right? There is something like that you can do in the West because we've created something on a monastic model. But that's not traditional, really. So I think people come to this practice and they think, well, it's all about sort of being a monk. Well, no, there's families practicing together, right? There are other ways to carry this practice forward than to do something which looks like monastic life. And so one of the things I think we're coming to terms with in this country is that our practice is a weird hybrid of lay practice and practice that in other places would be done by clergy in training. So we see this kind of intensive zazen. Well, if you go to Japan, Japanese people, lay people, are not doing a lot of intensive zazen. They might be coming to a zazen kai once in a while at a temple, but they're not doing sesshin every month. They're not doing a lot of this kind of ceremonial things, and they're not filling service positions. So lay people are not the ones ringing the bells, handing off the incense, right? Doing all of that. In this country, everybody participates, partly because we don't have that many people in robes, right? So if in your sangha you need to do a ceremony, you need to call on your sangha members to participate because that's who's here. In Japan, if we need to do a ceremony, I mean, there's a temple every 10 feet. You can get your neighbors to come in and help you. We don't have that here. The nearest temple might be in another state. So we've all had to learn to participate and to take leadership, which I think is a real change from what you would see in some place like Japan.
So within the American side of this modernization process, something I was picking up on what you were talking about is more lay participation, maybe more community involvement.
Yeah, and female too. Because there's the whole gender thing, sad to say, frequently in Japan, it's the women are, the nuns are making the tea and the men are leading the ceremonies. And if we as Westerners go to a training temple there and think we're going to change that, we're not. It's just one of those things we have to look around and observe and say, well, we're going to fit in as best we can and recognize that after hundreds and hundreds of years of that kind of cultural tradition, we're not going to go in and change that overnight. So we have to be able to function in that system, and maybe that's not the system we replicate here. But just recently, the person in charge of practicing Soto Zen practice in Europe, they've got like their first female in that job. That's never happened before. We've just recently had the first woman appointed to head our international center here in this country. So we're starting to see female leadership more and more, which is, it's a change. It's a change.
So again, within this kind of the American side of this greater modernization thing, within your own practice, so not necessarily kind of like the academic view of the larger, but within your own practice, how do you find like the American context, the American bias, which we have here, it like kind of plays into how you engage with the Dharma or the practice or however?
It can be easy to look back to the roots of the practice in Asia and say, that's the one true way. And as a beginning practitioner, I fell into that pitfall head first. It's easy to look around and say, what's happening here is a copy, or is a corruption, or is somehow not authentic because it's American, or because it's Western. And to say the only real practice is what's happening in Japan. Well, I mean, practice is practice, right? There are certain elements of our practice which are completely unrelated to what form we take. Buddha nature is Buddha nature. There's nothing outside the Buddha way. So that means the Buddha way is right here, just like it's everywhere else. So we don't have to step outside of something to find true practice. But that was a lesson I really had to learn. Because as a layperson, I looked around and said, I have to go to Japan just because that's where real practice is. And somehow this isn't good enough, or this isn't right, or something. So I went to Japan. I went as a tourist, but I went there looking for an opportunity to experience some kind of practice, or at least visit temples or something. And the rude shock that I got from that was, there is no one true way. Because even within Japanese Buddhism, even within Japanese Zen, even within Japanese Soto Zen, things are different from temple to temple. If you look at the two head temples, it's like two dialects of the same language. They don't do things the same way. And so I had to put aside this idea, which was my own, completely my own fabrication. There was one true way. And this wasn't it. Whatever I had here wasn't it. This was too ordinary. This can't be it. There's got to be something more interesting and exotic, and it's got to be over here. So I really had to give that up. And still, so I did, but I still have this attachment to, or respect for, the roots of this tradition, because I think that's important. But somehow for me, I had to get past, there's only one true way. So of course, then I'm reading about Dogen, who had exactly the same problem, and was looking around at his Japanese practice and saying, there's something not right about this. It's corrupt, it's a copy, it's not good enough, it's not real, I have to go to China. So he did exactly the same thing, right? It's just, sometimes it's really heartening when we read about our ancestors and they make all the mistakes that we made, right? They have all the same misunderstandings that we have. It happens over and over again. We go, that was me, So he says, I've got to go to China to find the roots of this practice, because what I have here it's not right. And I just think this is the human condition. Somehow what's right in front of us and is so everyday and is so ordinary, this can't be it. So our practice gives us an opportunity to step back from our preconceptions, our habituated thinking, our need for something else, because that's all about self, right? I want to do something different and exotic because it's going to make me special. Our practice is so about not being special, which is a real blow, right? It's a real disappointment that our practice makes us not special. But we really begin to see it's not about being somewhere other than here. It's not about doing something other than what I'm doing. It's about 100% wholeheartedly entering into this moment. What is right here? Well, there is nothing outside of this moment. There's nothing outside of what I'm doing. So being in America and doing something which is not Japanese, and wearing everyday clothes and doing everyday things and sitting on a cushion, that's all there is, right? There is nothing outside of that. So for some Americans, that's a blow. For some Americans, of course, they're not comfortable with the Japanese piece and want only to do something which looks like something American. But I think that's the same problem, just in a different form, right? We're still clinging, reaching, looking for something. That Japanese stuff is no good. I only want, American stuff. And somebody else is saying, well, this American stuff is no good. I only want, something more exotic. It's two sides of the same coin. So what it comes down to in our practice is we just have to sit down every day. We just have to do our jobs every day. We just have to walk the dog and balance the checkbook and wash the dishes and do our bodhisattva work with the forms and the causes and conditions we're given. We arose in this form somehow because of causes and conditions. And here we are. And this is what we have to work with. This is what we have to use to go out into the world and do our bodhisattva work and liberate beings. What have I got except this, right? So this body is the ground of our practice. And this body happened to be born as an American female in 1961, right? This is what I have to work with. So it's an important part of our practice to understand that and to not wish for something else, because there isn't anything else. In some ways, it's a bit difficult as an American to think about how do I do this as an American differently than the Japanese because I'm not Japanese, right? So I don't come at it with that. I come at it with what I have. So some teachers in this country have American teachers actually have a broad range of things to draw on. And you'll hear Dharma talks where people are quoting all kinds of stuff. They're not only quoting Dogen, they're quoting every modern poet. They're quoting news articles. They're quoting stuff off the internet and using it as a way to illustrate the Dharma in a way which feels relevant and fresh and contemporary and meaningful to people in their lives, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. If it's done skillfully, there's nothing wrong with that. Because, so often we find the teachings of the Buddha, teachings of Dogen, they're saying really interesting, useful, sometimes difficult things, but so often we look at it and say, but that's the same thing as this faith tradition would say. There's commonalities. There's something about the human experience which leads to understanding certain things or wanting to understand certain things. We all have the burning question, why am I here? What does it mean to be spiritually healthy? What does it mean to live an ethical life? What is my place in this universe? Because clearly there's something bigger here than me. So what is this self about? We're all asking the same questions. In America, we're doing that in a Buddhist context. But it's all about what is the human experience.
So you were talking about nothing being outside the Buddha way. There's just here now. And the practice is going to be in the context in which we do it, naturally. I'm curious, in a practical sense, especially in the context of leading a community, where is the balance between doing things in our own context that are relevant for us, that express the Dharma in our lives, versus respecting a tradition that it comes from? Kind of getting down to this, where do we respect a tradition versus almost do violence to a tradition? Where do we learn from ideas versus appropriate ideas? This kind of,
Well, yeah, cultural appropriation can be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
When we adopt things and we don't take the time to really deeply look into them, and somehow we use them to create self, that's a problem. If I'm going to adopt some Asian traditions in order to make myself more interesting, more exotic, more well-traveled or something, that's a problem. But in our practice, we're always trying to be watchful for what are we appropriating in any way to make the self, to create self, right? So it might be a Japanese form, it might be wearing interesting clothing, it might be who knows. So there's always kind of the danger of that. But I really think American practice develops quite naturally when we're simply sincerely practicing together. Because of the causes and conditions that lead to the arising of practice in any context, what evolves is going to be appropriate for that place and time and for those people. Which doesn't mean that we don't give some careful thought to what traditions or artifacts or forms or things do we carry forward. But I just find in my own teaching and in my own leadership that I don't have to think too hard about where is that line. If I'm an American person speaking to American people in America, something which is appropriate for that container is going to emerge, right? Because if I'm not doing something appropriate, I'm not going to reach people. And then somehow, there's no community there. So if we're coming together as a community to practice, what comes out of that is naturally appropriate and useful and meaningful for people. So when I give a Dharma talk on Sunday, I'll spend 45 minutes or an hour talking about a topic. But I really feel like my job there is not to talk about a topic so I educate the audience. I'm talking about the topic in order to throw out little things that we can chew on. Because to me, the real juice of that interaction is the Q&A that comes afterwards, which can go on for another half an hour. I mean, when people here really dig in, it's like we have some fabulous discussions and conversations because people are really internalizing that material. What does that mean in my life? What does that mean in my practice? Here's what I think about that. I just think that's where the energy is, right? So when I'm speaking English, speaking about the Dharma in English to an American audience, I might be making reference to Japanese texts, things in translation, parts of the tradition, but I'm throwing it out on the floor and saying, what does that mean for you? And people really pick it up, and they really dig into it. And so what comes out of that is something which is useful for people here. If you go on our website, you'll see there's a question in our FAQ about what do I call the abbot? And there's actually something in there that says, we don't append san to people's names here. People want to put, a name, san. And they think they're doing it to be respectful. And so the impulse is really nice. It's really very kind. People want to be respectful. So they'll take everybody's name and put san after it. Well, san is not a title. It's a particle of Japanese grammar, has no meaning in English whatsoever. So I frequently say to people, so for Americans speaking English to Americans in America, you don't need to put san on your... People will... Hoko-san, it's always Hoko-san. You don't need to do that with me. You're American speak... And these are folks that don't speak Japanese, right? So if it's coming from a Japanese person or somebody who speaks Japanese, like maybe, right? But I think naturally in this context, we don't need to do that. So that's one of those things that I think we can safely say, we can let go of it. We can speak English to each other and not feel compelled to do that because people want to append those names and do those things because you want to be part of an in-group, right? I want to show that I belong here. So the impulse is a very nice impulse. There's nothing wrong with the impulse. But how does it manifest here? Just use my name. So, if I'm speaking to a Japanese or someone who I think comes out of that culture, of course, but we want to do it because we want to be special and we want to be in and we want to show that we know something about this practice. It's our human condition. We can't beat ourselves up for that. That's our human condition. But that's one of those Dharma gates. It's one of those opportunities to look carefully and say, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What does it mean for American practice? So, I'm not going to come after anybody with a stick for it, but it's like I'd like to people just kind of loosen their grip on that thing a little bit.
So I'm curious then with, again, realizing these things in our own context, taking and leaving while evaluating those things. Going back to something, he was talking about the things are naturally going to become American, but we don't want it to happen too fast. So I'm curious, in this kind of like taking and leaving, you're curious on, or your thoughts on the speed or manner in which that is happening or will happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can speak mostly for Sanshin because that's where I am right now, and I think it's happening quite naturally here. Our abbot is Japanese and he's still here. So I think there will be a gradual transition. And because I trained in Japan and I do have the Sodosho affiliation, and I'm interested in not quickly losing those influences, I think it'll be a gradual transition that makes sense for people. I would not want to come in and make immediate drastic changes to what we do here because I think it's unsettling for people. When I arrived, people were a little bit nervous. How is she going to be different from Hojo-san? And those are legitimate questions. I mean, they were asking good questions. They were asking me things like, "What are your Dharma talks like?" Because I was kind of an unknown to them, right, as a leader. So I think at Sanshin the pace is happening in an appropriate way. And I think just in America in general, we're going to do this in fits and starts. When I look at the national conversation, some Sanghas want to make immediate changes. They want to make pretty big changes. They feel that's appropriate for their group. They know their group better than anybody, right? For some, it's going to be more cautious, and we want to take this a bit slowly, especially for older teachers who've trained for a long time in Japan. Those forms and those influences are personally important. I mean, I have to say, for me, there's some sentimental attachment there. When I see some things here or we behave in a certain way, it's like, it takes me back to my training in Japan. It means something for me, and I admit that. But I also know that a lot of people here don't have that context, so we have to do something that's appropriate. So I think by now, because we're a generation or two into this American transition, we've maybe modified the pace a bit. I don't think we're quite doing this, hurry up and wait kind of thing. Because it's been around, this practice has been around in this country for a little while. But when I look at the national conversation, it's still a live question. How Japanese do we want to be? At what point do we say this or that is not relevant? So I think it's something we're not going to really understand for like 100 years until we can look back and say, how did that go? It's like, I wish I was going to be around to look back in 100 or 150 years and say, how is that transition going, right? Because I think we're really in the formative stages of a lot of this stuff. I just think there's so many live questions. We don't know how this is going to develop, right? So we just go forward every day.
Within that, Hojo-san made the difference between, like, here in the Midwest with the Japanese abbot, like, we are kind of keeping things a little slower here, and things like on the West Coast, East Coast, changing much more rapidly.
Yes.
Assuming you've been out to some of those places, or at least have relationships with some of the people there. If you were to identify like some of the large things, like when I look at what they're doing, not that there's anything wrong with it, but like, that's very different from what we're doing here. Like, what are a few of those things that you notice that are very changing?
Well, I mean, so I guess I can't speak so much from a geographic perspective as from just looking at Sanshin's practice vision. So here at Sanshin, we have quite a describable practice vision, because Hojo-san's here to do a really specific thing, which in a way as a leader is helpful for me, because I kind of know what I'm picking up, what I'm walking into, because he's defined something that he wants to do here. So what's being offered here is what he wants to offer, as opposed to something which is being created in order to attract a large number of people. Neither one of those is better or worse, it's just that's our circumstance. So we tend to, for instance, not be as ecumenical as other places. And if you look around, I don't know if that's particularly on the coast, but just looking broadly around the country, the farther away we get from a Japanese teacher and lineage, it seems like the more ecumenical we start to become. So it's more than one kind of Buddhist practice. So you might have something which doesn't look so much like only Soto Zen. There might be Zazen, but there might also be a certain kind of chanting. Or there might be Tibetan slogan practice, or there might be other kinds of Japanese Buddhist or other kinds of Buddhist practice. Somebody's doing Vipassana over here, somebody's doing something over there. It might be a little more broad in that way. But interestingly, if you look at the history of Japanese Buddhism, or Buddhism as a whole, throughout its history, it's not uncommon for one temple to have practitioners of more than one kind of thing going on at the same time. So people would specialize in a particular thing, but you might have all kinds of people living together doing Buddhist practice, right? So in a way, it's a throwback to our early roots, So I think, one of the big changes would be just a pretty wide circle of influence and different kinds of activities, and just this kind of ecumenical practice where folks are maybe even a little bit loath to identify as Zen or even as Buddhist. When I was at Hokyoji, they were working on the mission, and they were determined, the board at that time was determined to write a mission which never mentioned Buddhism. Because it was trying to be that was a group that was trying to be very clear about what it was offering, and it really wanted to not create barriers for anybody. And so it really wanted to not label its practice. So its roots were very much, this was a Katagiri Roshi place when it was founded, right? So its roots were very much in Soto Zen, right? But the way it manifests today is quite different. And there's been real intention on their part to be quite broad and to include everyone that they can, and to include a variety of practices, and to do something which is different. So as things evolve, that may happen, because you drop this practice into a new culture and suddenly there's all these potential influences, right? So how can they not mix, right?
Going a little bit back to the modernization thing, but also in this idea of change happening at different rates at different places in the United States, some with certain affiliations, some with not. As all this is happening, both throughout the world and in America, but especially since we have a lot of Japanese traditional presence in terms of school-wise in America, do you find that there's criticism from more traditional teachers, especially since you're associated with the Soto Shu?
It's certainly a topic for discussion nationally about how quickly do we change and in what ways do we change. But I have to say that conversation remains respectful. And I think we all understand that the history of Buddhism is to move from one culture to another. This is not the first time this has happened. This is not the first time old wine has been poured into a new bottle, right? Because we know this practice started in India, it moved along the Silk Road. There were a lot of various influences, some that people aren't even that aware of, that happened along the Silk Road, until the thing gets to China, encounters a very different culture than Indian culture, which affected everything from the way the practice looked to the way the words were translated. There weren't even words for some of these things. When you look at, just cultural values, very, very different. In India, you were expected at some point, if you were a man, you were expected at some point to take some time in your life to sort of be an ascetic, be a wandering ascetic, and to leave behind your family responsibilities. Well, in China, that was a big problem, because in the Confucian society, somebody who left behind family responsibilities was no good, right? So this really had to get reconciled. If you're expecting to leave your family and join a Buddhist Sangha, this is a problem. So there are all of these little things. Well, then it moves on to Korea and Japan and finally to America. So in each case, there were new cultural influences. So in a way, we can look back and say, how has this happened up to this point? This isn't the first time this has gone on. So I think because we have that context for these conversations, we can remain respectful with each other and recognize that in a way it's kind of helpful, and it feels really American somehow, that there are all these different flavors of Soto Zen and all these flavors of Buddhism in this country, and people can find a community and a kind of practice and a practice style that works for them, right? So it doesn't have to be one thing only. It doesn't have to be, one thing doesn't have to try to meet everybody's needs. It feels somehow appropriate for America that the practice is evolving in certain ways in certain places. We have a huge country. Culture on the East Coast is different than culture in the Midwest, is different than culture in the South. So in a way, it makes a lot of sense that those things wouldn't look the same. Christianity doesn't look the same across the country, so there's no one Christianity, there's no one Buddhism. So I think there's not so much criticism of one teacher to another. I think there's just this widespread acknowledgement that this practice is really young in this country. It's going to be changing for a long time, and we can support each other in that. So that what comes out of that is perhaps a unique manifestation of this practice, but something which is appropriate for each community in its place and time.
So do you find there are any particularly unique things in the practice here in America that are beyond just like the globalization and modernization, things here that are, this is something that has come up here that is American? And again, maybe there's not, but...
Well, I think there's so much. I mean, it's almost hard to put your finger on all the things that might be different here. I think certainly this interest in the intersection of science and Buddhism, I see more in the West. And I guess maybe at this point I have to start talking about the West as opposed to America. I don't know. But there's this real interest in scientific Buddhism. People want to say, well, the Buddha was a scientist because he's really rational. And he's saying, don't just take what I'm telling you and believe it. Sit down on a cushion and see if it's true. If it's not true, do something else. And American people really like that. They really want to have this opportunity to practice for themselves and to verify for themselves as opposed to being handed a doctrine or handed some beliefs and say, you need to believe this because I said so. Buddha never said that. That seems to feel really important for Americans, right? But so there's this whole rational piece. Interestingly, there's also this psychological piece, which is very much about understanding emotions and being skillful with emotions and sort of understanding that whole how does the mind work thing and what is this self about, and using Buddhism as a way to heal trauma or emotional pain or suffering, right? So we have these two things that create this really interesting, two wings of the same bird or something, where on this one hand we've got Americans really love Buddhism because it's rational, and then on this side we've got people really love Buddhism because it's emotional and romantic, right? And so it seems like there are two kinds of communities or two kinds of practitioners. I think it would be hard for one person to hold both of those things. There's this interesting creative tension about that, right? But both of those things somehow feel uniquely American. And they're coming out of Western philosophical traditions and, just various, the way our society developed and all this kind of thing. But those two things for me kind of stand out. On the one hand, we have the rational scientific. On the other hand, we have the emotional romantic, and somehow it's all practice. We get to manifest practice in both ways, depending on what feels meaningful, right? Plus, we've also got the whole diversity piece here, which is really kind of interesting. So one of the real live questions in the national conversation is how do we become less white, frankly? This is a practice which people sometimes associate with elite white people, which is really interesting considering, it didn't come from here. But it has tended to be the people who read religion in college, the people who have access to travel, right? I mean, so we look around our sanghas in this country. There are certainly sanghas which have arisen because people have emigrated from somewhere. And it's a cultural center in the community. You go to your temple because it's one of the places that carries your culture. But then there are Dharma centers that are mainly convert Buddhists, right? People who were not born into a Buddhist culture, didn't emigrate from that kind of a place. And so you look around your Sangha, a lot of these Sanghas are pretty white. So there's a lot of conversation at the moment about how do we include people of color? How do we include Asian people? How do we include communities, Spanish-speaking communities, people who don't speak English? I mean, America is such a diverse place, and yet Buddhism has somehow not yet reflected that completely. So part of the continuing evolution, I think, is going to be how do we include everybody? How do we make everybody comfortable? How do we find the barriers? Because first we have to see them, right? How do we see them? How do we understand them? And then how do we get around them? So we're starting to see teachers of color which is interesting. We're starting to see people really making efforts to do some outreach into communities and saying, how do we include everybody in our practice and make it relevant and meaningful and comfortable and welcoming, right? Which is, so I'm going to be interested to see how that unfolds. And when we look around the room and we see a real variety of people, that's going to be an interesting influence on our practice.